The security camera footage from Murphy's Corner store would later become legendary among law enforcement, but it started as just another routine robbery in a rough neighborhood. Three armed teenagers, full of confidence and bad intentions, walked into what they thought was an easy target: a small store run by an elderly man who looked like he couldn't hurt a fly. 82-year-old Frank Sullivan was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when they entered, moving slowly and deliberately, like most men his age. The robbers figured they were looking at maybe 30 seconds of work, wave the guns around, demand the money, and walk out richer than they'd walked in. But Frank Sullivan wasn't just any elderly store clerk. He was a Marine veteran who'd earned 3 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star during World War II. A man who'd fought in battles where hesitation meant death and quick thinking meant survival. When those 3 young criminals made the mistake of underestimating him, they were about to learn that some training never leaves you, some reflexes never slow down, and some men remain dangerous no matter how old they get. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 11:34 p.m. as 3 figures in dark hoodies pushed into Murphy's Corner store. Frank Sullivan looked up from the cigarette display he was restocking, his weathered hands moving methodically as he arranged the packs in neat rows. At 82, Frank moved with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to consequences he'd rather avoid. The store was typical of its neighborhood: fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows over rows of convenience items, lottery tickets behind scratched plexiglass, and the ever-present hum of refrigerated cases filled with energy drinks and beer. Frank had been working the night shift here for 3 years, ever since his pension wasn't quite enough to cover his medications and his late wife's medical bill. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him busy during the long hours when sleep wouldn't come and memories of battles fought 70 years ago seemed more real than the present. The 3 young men who'd just entered moved with the nervous energy of predators sizing up their prey. The leader, a tall kid with cold eyes visible through his ski mask, couldn't have been older than 20. His 2 companions flanked him, their hands shoved deep in their pockets, bodies tense with anticipation. Frank noticed all of this in the space of a heartbeat, his mind automatically cataloging details the way it had been trained to do decades ago in places where observation meant survival. "Evening, boys," Frank said calmly, continuing to stock cigarettes without looking directly at them. "Little late for a store run, isn't it?" The leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the empty aisles. "Yeah, old man, it is. But we're not here to shop." In one fluid motion, all 3 pulled handguns from their hoodies, cheap pistols that had probably seen more crime than maintenance. The weapons were pointed directly at Frank, who finally turned to face them with the same unhurried movements he'd been using all evening. "Well now," Frank said softly, his voice carrying none of the fear the robbers were expecting, "that's a problem." The leader stepped forward, his gun wavering slightly, as he tried to project authority he didn't really feel. "Open the register, old man. Empty it out. All the cash, the lottery tickets, everything valuable. Do it now and nobody gets hurt." Frank looked at the 3 young faces behind their masks, noting the way they held their weapons too high, too tense, fingers on triggers instead of resting along the guards. Amateurs? Dangerous amateurs, but amateurs nonetheless. In Guadalcanal, men who held their rifles like that usually didn't survive their first firefight. "Boys," Frank said, his tone almost conversational, "I think you've made a mistake coming in here tonight." The second robber, shorter and stockier than his leader, gestured aggressively with his pistol. "The only mistake would be you not opening that register. This is a robbery, old man. We've got guns." Frank's eyes moved from weapon to weapon, assessing angles, distances, and possibilities, with the cold calculation of a man who'd once had to make similar assessments under enemy fire. 70 years ago, he'd been Staff Sergeant Frank Sullivan, 1st Marine Division, Pacific Theater. He'd survived Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Iwo Jima battles where young men died by the thousands, and only the smartest, fastest, and most ruthless lived to see another sunrise. "I can see that," Frank replied evenly. "But here's what you can't see, son. This isn't my first time having guns pointed at me." The leader's confidence flickered for just a moment. There was something in the old man's voice, something that didn't fit with their expectations of an easy target. But greed and youthful arrogance quickly reasserted themselves. "Just open the damn register!" he shouted, taking another step forward. "I'm not playing around here." That's when Frank moved. 70 years of peaceful living hadn't erased the muscle memory that had kept him alive through 3 major Pacific campaigns. In one explosive motion, Frank dropped below the counter, his old bones moving with startling speed as training that had been drilled into him during the bloodiest war in human history took over. The robbers stood frozen for a crucial half-second, their brains struggling to process what had just happened. They'd expected compliance or cowering. They hadn't expected their elderly victim to disappear like smoke. Frank reappeared a heartbeat later, but not where they expected. He'd moved left along the counter with the fluid precision of a man who'd once had to outmaneuver Japanese soldiers trying to kill him with bayonets. In his hand was something that made all 3 robbers' blood run cold, a sawed-off shotgun that Frank kept mounted under the register for exactly this kind of situation. "Now then," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd once ordered Marines into battle. "I believe we need to have a different conversation." The shotgun was pointed directly at the leader, held with the steady hands of someone who'd fired similar weapons in far more dangerous circumstances. Frank's stance was textbook military, balanced, ready to move, eyes focused but aware of all 3 targets. The third robber, who hadn't spoken until now, began backing toward the door. "This wasn't supposed to happen, man. This was supposed to be easy." "Easy?" Frank asked, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. "Son, if you wanted easy, you should have picked a different store, and a different night, and definitely a different old man." The leader was still trying to process how quickly the situation had reversed. One moment they'd been in control, 3 armed men against 1 elderly clerk. Now they were staring down the barrel of a shotgun, held by someone who clearly knew how to use it. "You can't do this," the leader protested, though his gun was now pointing at the floor rather than at Frank. "We're the ones with the guns." Frank's expression didn't change. "Boy, I've been shot at by professionals. I've had mortars landing close enough to throw dirt in my face. I've fought hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers who were trying to stick bayonets in my gut. What exactly do you think you 3 amateurs are going to do that's going to scare me?" The second robber was looking around frantically, searching for an escape route that didn't involve getting past the man with the shotgun. "Who are you, old man? You're not supposed to be able to do this." "Frank Sullivan," came the calm reply. "Staff Sergeant, 1st Marine Division, Pacific Theater, World War II. 3 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, and more confirmed kills than I care to remember. And right now, I'm the man telling you to put those toys down before someone gets hurt." The weapons in the robbers' hands suddenly felt very heavy. None of them had expected resistance, and they certainly hadn't expected to find themselves facing down a decorated war veteran who looked more comfortable holding a gun than they felt holding theirs. But the leader wasn't ready to give up. "There's still 3 of us and 1 of you, old man. War hero or not, the math doesn't work in your favor." Frank's smile was cold and humorless. "Son, I once held a hill against 40 Japanese soldiers for 6 hours with nothing but a rifle and determination. The math has never been a problem for me." To prove his point, Frank shifted the shotgun's aim to the light fixture directly above the leader's head and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space, and when the smoke cleared, sparks were raining down from the destroyed light. "That was a warning shot," Frank said calmly, pumping another shell into the chamber. "The next one won't be." The third robber dropped his gun and bolted for the door. "I'm out. This is insane." The second robber hesitated for a moment, torn between loyalty to his partner and self-preservation. Self-preservation won, and he too dropped his weapon and ran. That left just the leader, standing alone in the dimly lit store, facing a man who'd just demonstrated that age hadn't diminished his ability to handle dangerous situations. The young criminal's hands were shaking now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "What's it going to be?" Frank asked quietly. "You can drop that gun and walk out of here, or you can find out exactly what a Marine learns about handling threats to innocent people." The gun hit the floor with a metallic clatter, and the leader raised his hands. "Please, man, I'm sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen. We thought you were just an old guy." Frank stepped out from behind the counter, moving with the same measured pace he'd maintained throughout the encounter. "That's your problem right there, boy. You thought, but you didn't think enough." He reached for the phone behind the counter, never taking his eyes off the remaining robber. "You see, the thing about being old is that you've had time to learn things. Important things, like how to read people, how to handle pressure, and how to deal with punks who think they can take what doesn't belong to them." The police arrived 7 minutes later to find Frank calmly sitting behind his counter, the shotgun safely stored away, while the would-be robber sat on the floor with his hands behind his head. The security camera footage would later show the entire incident, from the robbers' confident entrance to their panicked flight, with Frank's calm competence throughout serving as a masterclass in how to handle an armed confrontation. Detective Maria Santos, who responded to the call, couldn't hide her amazement as she reviewed the footage. "Mr. Sullivan, I have to ask, where did you learn to handle yourself like that?" Frank looked up from the incident report he was filling out, his expression matter-of-fact. "Guadalcanal, detective. Though I have to say those Japanese soldiers were a lot more professional than these three." The detective shook her head in admiration. "Well, you certainly haven't lost your touch. These kids had no idea what they were getting into." "That's the thing about young people today," Frank observed. "They see an old man and they think weak. They don't stop to consider that some of us got old by being very, very good at not dying when people tried to kill us." But Frank's night wasn't over yet. As the detective finished taking his statement and the crime scene was being processed, the store's owner, Jim Murphy, arrived after getting the call about the attempted robbery. Murphy was a man in his 50s who had inherited the store from his father and had been struggling to keep it profitable in an increasingly dangerous neighborhood. "Frank, are you okay?" Murphy asked, rushing through the door past the police officers. "When I got the call, I thought, well, I was afraid something terrible had happened to you." Frank waved off his concern. "I'm fine, Jim. Just a little excitement to break up the routine." Murphy looked around at the evidence markers, the broken light fixture, and the spent shotgun shell on the floor. "A little excitement. Frank, you single-handedly stopped an armed robbery. At your age, most people would have just handed over the money and hoped for the best." "Most people," Frank said with a slight smile, "weren't Marines." The story of the attempted robbery spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the next evening, Murphy's corner store had a steady stream of visitors, not customers looking to buy cigarettes and lottery tickets, but people who wanted to meet the 82-year-old war hero who'd sent 3 armed robbers running for their lives. The local news picked up the story, and soon Frank found himself reluctantly famous. The footage of the incident went viral on social media, with millions of viewers watching the elderly clerk transform from apparent victim to formidable defender in a matter of seconds. But for Frank, the attention was uncomfortable. He'd never been one to seek glory or recognition for his actions, whether in war or in civilian life. When reporters asked him about his heroism, he deflected their questions with the same modest demeanor he'd maintained for 70 years. "I wasn't being heroic," he told a persistent journalist. "I was just doing what needed to be done. Those boys made a mistake, and I corrected it. That's all." The journalist pressed him for details about his military service, but Frank was equally reluctant to discuss his war record. "That was a long time ago," he said simply. "Different world, different problems. But some things don't change. You stand up to bullies, you protect innocent people, and you don't let punks think they can take what isn't theirs." What Frank didn't tell the reporters was how the incident had affected him personally. For days afterward, he found himself remembering things he'd worked hard to forget: the sound of gunfire on distant beaches, the faces of young Marines who hadn't made it home, the weight of decisions that had meant life or death for the men under his command. The robbery attempt had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for decades. Not violence or aggression, but the sharp clarity that came from facing danger and emerging victorious. For a few minutes in that store, he'd felt like the young Marine he'd once been, before age and loss had taught him that most battles weren't worth fighting. 1 week after the incident, Frank was restocking shelves when the bell above the door chimed. He looked up to see a young man in his early 20s, nervous but determined, approaching the counter. For a moment, Frank's hand moved instinctively toward the shotgun before he recognized the visitor as one of the three robbers, the one who'd been first to run when the situation went sideways. "Mr. Sullivan," the young man said hesitantly, "my name is Marcus. I was here last week. I was one of the guys who tried to rob you." Frank studied the young man's face, noting the absence of the mask that had hidden his features during the attempted robbery. "I remember. You were the smart one, first to realize you were in over your head." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to come back and apologize. What we did was wrong, and I've been thinking about it every day since it happened. The way you handled us, it made me realize some things about myself that I didn't like, such as the fact that I was willing to threaten an innocent person for money, such as the fact that I judged you based on your age and thought you'd be an easy target, such as the fact that I never stopped to think about what kind of person I was becoming." Frank nodded slowly. "And what kind of person is that, Marcus?" "The kind of person my grandfather would be ashamed of," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He served in Vietnam. He always told me about honor and service and standing up for what's right. But I threw all that away for what? A few $100s. Frank came around the counter and gestured for Marcus to take a seat on the bench near the front window. "Tell me about your grandfather." For the next 30 minutes, Marcus talked about his grandfather's military service, his work ethic, and the values he'd tried to instill in his grandson. He talked about how his grandfather's death 2 years earlier had left him directionless and angry, falling in with the wrong crowd and making decisions that led inevitably to that night in the store. Frank listened without judgment, recognizing in Marcus's story echoes of his own post-war struggles. "Your grandfather sounds like a good man," he said finally, "and I think he'd be proud of you for coming here tonight." Marcus looked surprised. "But I tried to rob you. I threatened you with a gun. And then you recognized your mistake and you're trying to make it right," Frank replied. "That takes courage, son. Different kind of courage than what you showed last week, but courage nonetheless." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Marcus spoke again. "Mr. Sullivan, I know this might sound crazy, but would you be willing to tell me about your time in the war? I feel like I need to understand what real service looks like." Frank hesitated. He'd spent 70 years avoiding conversations about the war, deflecting questions from family members and reporters alike. But something about Marcus's earnest request, coming from a young man genuinely seeking redemption, touched something deep inside him. "All right," Frank said finally, "but understand this. War isn't glorious. It's not like the movies. It's mostly young men dying far from home, and the ones who survive spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of it." Over the next 2 hours, Frank told stories he'd never shared with anyone. Not his late wife, not his children, not the countless reporters who'd tried to interview him over the years. He talked about the fear that never left you, the bonds formed between men facing death together, and the weight of responsibility that came with leading others into combat. Marcus listened with rapt attention, understanding for the first time what his grandfather had experienced and what real courage looked like. "How do you carry all that?" he asked. "How do you live with those memories?" "You find ways to serve," Frank replied. "Not necessarily in uniform, but in life. You protect people who need protecting. You stand up to bullies. You try to leave the world a little better than you found it. Is that why you didn't just give us the money? Because you were protecting some?" Frank considered the question carefully. "I was protecting the idea that decent people shouldn't have to live in fear. I was protecting Jim's livelihood and the safety of this neighborhood, but mostly, I was protecting the principle that strength should be used to help people, not hurt them." Marcus left that night with a new understanding of himself and his potential. He enrolled in community college the following week, started volunteering at a veterans center, and began the long process of rebuilding his life according to the values his grandfather had tried to teach him. The other two robbers took different paths. The leader, angry and unrepentant, continued his criminal activities until he was arrested during another robbery attempt and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The second accomplice simply disappeared, leaving the city and never looking back. But Marcus's transformation was just beginning. 6 months after their encounter in the store, he returned to tell Frank that he'd been accepted into the police academy. "I want to protect people the way you protected that store. I want to be the kind of man my grandfather would be proud of." Frank smiled, feeling a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition and everything to do with watching a young man find his way. "Your grandfather already would be proud, son. You just needed to remember who you really were." 2 years later, Officer Marcus Washington graduated from the police academy with honors. Frank attended the ceremony, sitting in the back row and applauding quietly when Marcus's name was called. The young man had specifically requested that Frank be there, crediting their conversations with changing the direction of his life. After the ceremony, Marcus approached Frank with his family in tow. "Mr. Sullivan, I'd like you to meet my grandmother. She's my grandfather's widow, and she's been wanting to thank you for what you did for me." The elderly woman took Frank's hands in hers. "My Harold always said that real warriors fight for others, not for themselves. Thank you for showing my grandson what that looks like." Frank found himself moved in a way he hadn't expected. "Your husband was right, ma'am, and your grandson is going to make a fine officer." As the years passed, Frank's legend grew in the neighborhood. The story of the 82-year-old war hero who'd stopped an armed robbery became the stuff of local folklore, told and retold until the details became larger than life. But for Frank, the real victory wasn't the moment he'd sent 3 criminals running. It was watching Marcus become the man he was meant to be. The lesson was profound and simple. Respect isn't automatically granted based on age, but it should be earned through character and action. The young criminals who'd entered Murphy's Corner store that night had seen only an elderly man they assumed was weak and vulnerable. They hadn't seen the depth of experience, the hard-won wisdom, and the unshakable principles that truly defined Frank Sullivan. More importantly, they'd learned that strength comes in many forms. Physical prowess fades with time, but courage, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, those qualities can actually grow stronger with age and experience. Frank's story became a reminder that every elderly person carries within them a lifetime of experiences, challenges overcome, and lessons learned. The quiet senior citizen stocking shelves or sitting on a park bench might once have stormed enemy beaches, saved lives in an emergency room, or built businesses that employed hundreds of people. Their age doesn't make them weak. It makes them repositories of wisdom and strength that young people are only beginning to develop. Respect for elders isn't about politeness or tradition. It's about recognizing the accumulated courage and character that comes from surviving and thriving through decades of life's challenges. As Frank continued to work his night shifts at Murphy's Corner store, he did so with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just an elderly man filling time until the end came. He was a guardian, a teacher, and a bridge between generations. His presence in that store, his willingness to stand up to danger, and his patient mentoring of Marcus had rippled outward in ways he couldn't fully measure. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant battlefields, but in convenience stores and community centers, in quiet conversations and moments of moral courage. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't recorded in history books, but in the transformation of a single young person who learns what it truly means to serve others. Frank Sullivan understood this truth better than most. He'd earned his medals and his place in history through extraordinary acts of valor during wartime, but his lasting legacy would be measured not in enemies defeated or battles won, but in lives changed and principles passed on to the next generation. The old warrior still had plenty of fight left in him, and in a world that often forgot the value of its elders, that was a lesson worth learning. If this story moved you, remember that age and experience are not signs of weakness, but of strength refined by time. The next time you see an elderly person, consider the battles they may have fought, the challenges they've overcome, and the wisdom they've accumulated. Respect isn't something that fades with age, it's something that deepens with every year of life well lived. And remember that heroes come in all ages, and true courage never really retires.